Let's go.
Okay, I'll call to order the curriculum committee meeting. And we have Joan sitting in for Mark.
Mark Hetzel.
Mark Hetzel, okay. And we have Ted here, so we have the three here. I need a motion to approve the agenda.
So ordered.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
And I have received no public comments. Anyone else?
Nothing.
Okay, then Tim, if you want to take over the next couple items.
Sure. So every year, we have to approve a testing and assessment schedule. And this, and if Joan and Judy, you maybe remember this conversation from last year. Ted, you weren't on the board yet, but we did some things a little more, see how it goes last year, just because of the unique circumstances we were in. But in general, what you see here is taking us back to what would have been our pre-pandemic testing and assessment schedule. But there are some changes that I do want to bring to your attention. So you may remember, and so when you look at this, you'll see special characters. And there should be a key at the bottom of the document that will tell you what those special characters stand for. But you may remember that the state requires us to screen students in 4K, if we operate at 4K, which we do, through second grade for early literacy readiness. Up until now, we have used the PALS assessment totally for that. When the state first implemented that requirement about 8 years ago, PALS was the screener required by the state. After a few years, the state kept the requirement that you conduct the screener, but the state no longer required a specific screener. We kept PALS for a few years after that. But last year, something that Amy worked with the elementary teachers on, they had a committee for this, was a review of what PALS was giving us, what some of our other options could be. And so there's no real good substitute for PALS for 4K. So PALS is continuing for 4K, but for kindergarten, first and second grade, we are discontinuing PALS, and we are giving a early primary grade version of the STAR. So we use STAR for math at the elementary level, and we use STAR reading for grades 3 through 6. So this is a relative to STAR. And what actually happens is the kids become stronger readers. Usually around second grade, they will drop off the STAR early literacy, and we'll pick them up on the STAR reading, but it really depends on the reading progress of the student. So we feel that the real impact of this is going to be less assessment time. If you were to look at this last year, a full administration of the PALS, we would have estimated it would take a teacher 10 hours to do the PALS for the entire class. The STAR early literacy is not totally complete. There are still teacher interviews, kids that are part of this. They can be done in smaller groups. And we anticipate it will reduce the time down to 2.5 hours. And the committee that looked at this felt like we would get the information. First of all, this does meet the state requirements. So in the state's eyes, it's a valid assessment. The teacher committee that looked at this felt like it would still give them the information they needed to pinpoint students who needed additional support early on and what types of support they might need. So that's a change. The other, and so that was a change by our full choice. The other change that's on here, and Rebecca, if you maybe want to go ahead to page 2, is we received a notification from ACT in late March that they were discontinuing, they're starting to phase out the Aspire. And they were discontinuing the short form of the Aspire that we've been using at the middle school, effective at the end of June. So in late March, we found we would have to replace the Aspire by the fall. And so we did convene a committee of middle school staff that looked at options. And the recommendation from that committee is to move to something called iReady. It's a tech, like all of these today, is a technology-based assessment. It's adaptive, like a lot of the assessments today. So it looks at how a student answers a question, and the better a student does, the more challenging questions they get. If a student misses questions, then they're presented with easier questions. The thing that the middle school will be looking at with iReady that wasn't a case with the Aspire is that iReady does, based on your iReady results, included with the testing package, there are some kind of computer-guided learning activities that kids can access based on their iReady results. And I do know that the middle school is going to review that as a possibility for some kids during their win time at the middle school. But I think the most significant thing from the assessment schedule standpoint is this is the replacement for the Aspire. And again, the Aspire is going away. We couldn't keep it. And the committee reviewed the options. They looked at iReady, they looked at STAR, they looked at QuestBridge, they looked at FastBridge, they looked at MAP, and in the end, they looked at
Tim, is the 440 minutes per time or total estimate of the year?
Okay, so it might have been to my benefit to add additional lines in here because this doesn't all totally line up. The iReady is the 120 minutes.
Oh, all right, okay,
The 250 and the 440 are the forward, which is the state exam.
okay.
And the reason why the 8th grade,
Oh.
that's where the science, so they take 4 subject tests
Okay,
in
I
4th
get
grade and 8th grade. So 4th grade and 8th grade have more time on the forward than the other grades.
So in the 120, that's just the fall. And then if they need to be reassessed, then they go to winter.
Yes.
And then again, if they need to be reassessed, they go to spring.
Yeah.
Okay,
Now, there's a possibility if this idea of kids being involved in differentiated activities that win is something they choose to do, they might increase this. But by way of contrast, the iReady just has an ELA and a math test. And the Aspire was like had like a junior ACT. So it had a math, a science, a reading, and an English. There were 4. And those were typically 45 minutes each. So this is really a change from 180 for Fall Aspire last year to 120 for iReady this year, partly because iReady just assesses ELA and math.
when they did Aspire, did they also use that format that they didn't have to reassess
Yes.
everybody all the time?
Yes. Yeah, the language here, this is all identical. The only thing that's different from what you would have seen 2 years ago would be this last sentence, as iReady is new for us, this year adjustments may be made. And what I mean by that is I know when they were looking at it, the review committee liked the possibility of these guided packages to, the kid who's really struggling and during win time is selected by a teacher to come in for extra help. That's not what this would be for. But kind of a soft spot in win, as they think about it at the middle school, is that it's the students who need help with a teacher or need to make up a particular project in the class, they get that. But then for many other students, it's a study hall. Now, a lot of our kids are busy. It's not like there's no value in the study hall. Middle school also has the homeroom time. There's some things with the middle school schedule that, I know Jeff Venus would like, his faculty to look at over the next year or two. But there was an interest in the review committee that, they want to kind of take it back to the larger school faculty and kind of say, well, with the iReady, a student in WIN could have these guided pieces that might support them. In the lower grades, sometimes kids work on Greenbox or other self-guided things. And there's definitely an interest in that, for the middle school. But whether they'll do that or not, it's kind of premature because the committee that was interested in it, their role was to make an assessment recommendation.
And was that committee the full assessment committee or just a committee of?
It was just a middle school committee.
Okay.
How many make up that committee?
Yeah, do they just volunteer?
So when we got our March surprise, Jeff and I sat down. And in the end, we decided to go ahead of a committee that included all of the coordinators plus a few people. So it was Jeff Keenis and Mike Sabell as school administrators. Stephanie Boyd as the ELA coordinator for the building. John Ely as math coordinator for the building. Chad Fanta as the social studies coordinator for the building. Jessica North as the science coordinator for the building. Lori Gallagher as, she's not the coordinator, that's actually another person, but Lori is our 712 chair for special ed. Then we also had, who else we have? Kyle Drops, who's a technical grader. These are all technology-based pieces today, and part of what Kyle does is to support our implementation of the technology-based assessments. And then also Jenny Topol, and Jenny's a school psychologist for middle school. And school psychologists look at a lot of our assessments, including for the RTI system. We felt coordinators because, one, they can bring it back to their content area teams. Secondly, we got this news over spring break, end of the year, even though we're starting to get some relaxation from the pandemic, it wasn't atypical. End of the year, all of those leadership people are stipended for extra time. So we felt it would be easier to ask coordinators to put in extra time for the committee in our semi-unusual circumstances rather than during a full school year. I think it was a pretty representative.
You mentioned 3 different ones that they looked at least 3 that I heard: STAR, Fastbridge, and math. Or
Map.
Map. Oh, the map.
And we also looked at, and this was the 4th. So we really looked at 4. We also looked at Mosaic, which is ACT's replacement for the Aspire, the discontinuing. But, Mosaic is very new. And just, we had demo accounts set up for most of the vendors. We spent time on the demo accounts. We requested material from the vendors. That's what we used. MAP was an assessment we used in most of our grades back from about 2002 to about 2012 and 2013. And then we discontinued it in favor of the STAR and the Aspire. The iReady is similar in a lot of respects to the MAP. And those were really kind of the 2 leading contenders in the end with the committee, but iReady was the decision.
What's the biggest plus and minus both ways of that for the iReady that the committee saw anyway?
So what the committee liked about iReady is it is a very well-established computer adaptive assessment. It has very good reporting. It will show students' growth. It will also show where they are on the standards. And it'll give us a percentile. So it meets all of our minimum requirements for a benchmark assessment or a screener. Now, what made iReady separate out a little bit was it has pretty strong reports compared to its competitors. based on the standards, so it provides you with that standardized score, the percentile rank, pupil growth. But then as a teacher, if you want to see how your students are doing in terms of performance by the standards that you're teaching to, it has solid reporting for that. I think the other thing that was attractive to the committee, although it was a nice to have, not a need to have, was that iReady, you could use that report and develop these differentiation activities. There's also a capability in iReady, but again, this is a nice to have, not a need to have, that a teacher, if they wanted to, and I don't think our teachers probably will have, but it's an option if they wish, they could use the iReady assessment engine and come up with, depending on their unit, an iReady assessment to support their unit assessment. I think in general, our teachers like to do their own assessments for the units, but that was an option. And it's close with the map, and I think in the end, you know, the thing that put iReady a little ahead of the map, and there were proponents for map on the committee, were one that iReady had a little stronger standards-based reporting, and it had these other features that we might or might not access. But again, it was fairly close between iReady and map.
Any concerns or negatives from it that stand out?
So I think the only thing that we are going to keep engaged with iReady on is that these differentiated packages go up to 8th grade. And, you know, at first blush, you'd say, well, it's a 7th and 8th grade middle school. If the differentiation packages go up with 8th grade, where's the problem there? And the issue is we're a very high population, so there'd be a certain number of students who might test out of some of those activities. Now, iReady's assessment in recent years has added on the ability for a high school assessment. So the test is there for the high school. The differentiation package is lagging a few years behind. And at such a point in time as they begin to offer the differentiation package for the high school, then I think you could have greater confidence that any student would have kind of that supplemental piece for win. As it stands out, with most of our kids now, I'd say that's the only flying one.
And you talk about these packages or like add-on type things. So I'm assuming each one of them has a cost that's associated with it.
It's actually all inclusive.
It's all inclusive. So
That's been a trend with many assessments today, is that say a decade ago, you would buy the assessment, and then if you wanted to purchase the differentiation support, you would go ahead and purchase that as a value add or not. Today, they tend to be included. That was part of what happened with ACT. ACT Aspire was one of the last of the standalone assessments. And in the case of ACT, their new Mosaic product tries to offer those differentiation pieces too, but it's brand new. MAP, which again used to be a standalone package, now comes with a connector over to Khan Academy. It's not as integrated as what iReady has, but that's another vendor in the market space that's kind of made that jump. It's changed a lot in the last 10 years.
Sure. But competitively, I mean, is that a factor that the committee looks at as well? I have no idea in terms of the cost of those packages. Is it different? Is it, you know?
The costs for all of these were comparable.
Okay.
So cost wasn't a major factor. And, you know, the presence of these differentiation packages was not one of our primary criteria either. But when you had packages that were being evaluated fairly closely, iReady's edge there was something that helped the committee. It would be nice if we were still in the era where we could just kind of get standalone packages, but that's not so much the case.
Okay.
Other than that, I think everything else on here really is the same. Based on what ACT is doing with the local version of the Aspire that was on fairly short notice sunsetted for us. I'm assuming, but I don't know what the long-term picture is. I'm assuming that this coming year will be the last year that Aspire will be the 9th and 10th grade state assessment. I'm assuming that ACT, as I understand it, is after this upcoming year, they're going to retire the big version of Aspire for their state customers. And I'm not sure where Wisconsin is going to go for 22, 23, but this is the 21, 22 schedule.
Tim, before we leave this topic, just circling back to something I hear frequently from listening sessions. The assessment committee, the big committee, not the stand, not the 7th and 8th grade that you just spoke about, the large assessment committee. We had heard the leadership of the teaching union frequently want to know who's on that committee. Does it change? Once on, always on? How fluid is it? How is it originally selected? Has that information been given to the teachers, or is that available? You know what I mean? That's a topic that frequently gets asked of us. How do we get on these committees and who's on these committees?
So when we do the large district-wide assessment committee, we don't have that group meet annually. I mean, if it was a desire to have it meet annually, we could, and then we could have the appointment process very much like another committee. When we've done it in the past, we've treated it as an assessment committee for that year to kind of do a certain kind of review. And maybe we should move to an annual committee. I mean, I think I'd have to check with Amy to see how people were selected onto that early literacy piece.
There's, and I don't know if you've been at the meetings where this has repeatedly come up. So there's no background assessment committee per se. You just like you needed a 7th and 8th grade, you collect who you need at the time you need them and review what you need.
Yes, when we've had a need for a change, we've convened the committee.
And maybe this isn't.
And because these were the two changes here, the first change with early literacy was a change we sought out. So Amy constituted that committee early in the year, and they met over the course of last year. And then the middle school piece was kind of an unexpected opportunity we had in the spring. And so we treated that as a middle school only thing.
Yeah.
And without talking with Kyle and Ashley, it's difficult to know.
And I don't need to create another standing committee. Please know that. I just, as I see work done by committee and I think of their concern yearly, who's on the committees and how you get on them. I just wanted to bring it up, but I get that this is, most of this is mandated and, we have changes because things expire and it's a little different data than, an ongoing committee. But I thought there was a background standing committee, but if there isn't, that's okay.
Well, and I think just because you have a committee doesn't mean it has to meet. So I mean, if it would help.
And it is something, maybe, I don't know who the leadership is this year. I think actually in kind of both. But, as we get back into school and start meeting with them, maybe it's something that, I'm just advocating for it to, make sure that the information is being shared with that group so that they know how and why people are on.
So this is the schedule.
And you need a motion to. approve
We'll
this.
need a motion. This will go to Monday nights.
Motion to approve the testing for the 2021-22 school year.
I'll second it. Any discussion? You have any issues, Ted?
No, I like that, the time seems to be reduced on it. That's a big thing that I hear with testing and,
Yes,
with our
exactly.
kids, especially going through it, it's why all this testing and it's taking away from learning. I mean, that's the ridiculousness of it. So I like that aspect at face value, so.
Mhm.
And I think historically in the last decade or so, that's been kind of the big piece of input we have had from teachers is
Absolutely.
we need a certain amount of valid information, but we also need to be
Teach.
protective of instructional time.
Absolutely.
I like that the spring is optional because that's when the testing becomes more and more difficult.
That's the state testing.
It's that spring testing when everybody is testing.
I mean, a concern, not all tests are created equal, right? So I don't know what the test makeup is and what it looks like and, but I never knew the other ones either. You know, you definitely, there's differences and is it testing to the same level? Is it something I can't speak to, but
And
Probably
then the
gonna look
mandate
into it.
makes a big difference when it's required, so.
I mean, both new assessments that are coming on here are not unique to us. I mean, many STAR customers, we had probably been unique in holding on to PALs through as many grades as we did. A lot of other districts had already moved on to STAR early literacy. And I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, everybody locally that uses it, I know that's what the course. So it's Map, and STAR, I would say various iterations of that is probably 95% of the testing.
I mean, that's a, it's a good question. How does this pool of choices exist? How do you find out stuff like, what are they using references from other teachers? From maybe you guys in terms of, these are the choices out there, you know? I guess how does
That's a great question. So pretty much we survey the landscape, you know, what
you
whether
guys,
you're a
like
teacher-
you, everyone on the committee, like,
Well, so specifically for the middle school. Right?
Okay.
It started with a meeting of me, Jeff Keenest, Mike Seibel, Lynn Stemroos. I left Lynn off. Lynn's the instructional coach for middle school. She was also part of the thing. Lynn Stemroos and Kyle Bratz, the technical grader. And we said, okay, we're still kind of under a little bit of modified workload for teachers because of the pandemic. We would normally take a year to find our replacement assessment. We're finding out in late March that this goes away at the end of June. We need something for September. We got to make a selection, get it on the schedule, get staff trained, all of that. So partly we discussed what was the most equitable way to kind of form a committee. And we felt like, let's go to the content area chairs and coordinators. They've got that leadership, some additional expectations. It also gives us good representation coverage. Then the other thing was what assessments did we want included? And of the ones we looked at, Mosaic, Map, iReady, STAR, FastBridge, we identified all but one in that initial group. But when the committee met for the first time, we said, so in our group, as we kind of scanned the landscape, here were the ones that we saw as the ones you typically see in the marketplace. And
I mean, that was really the question. It's, you probably gave those recommendations to the committee. Does the committee know that, I mean, that's what I'm saying, like going into it, is there this list out there of these are these are tests to choose from, or is it coming from you guys, say, these are the
So
most
so the
appropriate
answer is
ones?
yes, there are some lists.
Okay.
But yeah, I was probably the person who kind of looked
Okay.
at that list and said, here's what I see
Sure.
as the common ones. But then we went to the committee and we said, are there any other ones you would like us to consider
Okay.
based on your experience in networks? Jenny, our school psychologist, said, you know, I'd like to see us take a look at Fastbridge. So we
Okay.
included an additional one based on that.
Yeah,
That's a good question.
So I think there's a motion on the table.
and the second is.
Seconded.
Seconded, so,
So, read Ted,
um,
everybody?
Aye.
Aye. All right.
So the next one is just more of an information item because it'll be actually an action item for the full board Monday, but I just wanted to update you on what you will see for chair and coordinator appointments on Monday. And so, again, this is a refresher, chairs and coordinators are on a 3-year rotation. And ones that are up this year are in red. Almost all of them are on a regular rotation, with the exception that the person who has been our K-6 special engineer wants to step back from that role. So Tiffany is currently recruiting, and we don't, I believe, have anybody yet to have that for the remaining 2 years of that 3-year term. So that's still TBD. Everything else is filled. Where you see an asterisk, except when I make a mistake, it's somebody who's new to the position. Rhonda Knapp actually is the incumbent CTE coordinator, so she shouldn't have an asterisk. But Sarah Wendorf is going to co-chair LEMTech with Melissa Hill. It's Sarah's first time in the position. Ann Bennett is replacing Dina Bach for reading. And then with Carol Gray's retirement, Brian Barfnecht and Katrina Specht have agreed to share the high school social studies coordinator role. And when that happens, the two individuals split the stipend and they split the workload.
and you advertise to the whole.
Everybody.
To everybody.
Everybody sees it. Yeah. The only one where there's a little bit of a restriction is, slide up to reading for a moment. We treat the chair of the, so there's a state requirement that we have a district reading specialist. And that person has to hold the 317 license, which is a higher grade of reading license with more formal education than the 316 license. You need to be a reading teacher. And so our pool, because we use the reading chair in that way, the pool of candidates, and most of our reading teachers have a 317, but we do need somebody with a 317 to be chair there because we use them. And again, this is just an information item. So again, some new faces, a lot of continuity, in one position was still. But that position wasn't open when we did the main recruitment. That's a recruitment that just happened in the last few weeks. And so, this is all new to you, Ted. We sent out an email, and it will lay out what the job description for a chair is, what a job description for the coordinator is. It will list all of the open spots that we have. And by open, I mean the 3-year term is up. Incumbents have to reapply. And it has a description of our process. So if only one person applies, or sometimes you'll have situations, as happened here, where they both applied, but in their application, they said they wanted to be considered as a team and they would not be individually interested. If there's only one person, that's that. If we have multiple people apply, we interview them, and then we make a decision based on the interview. In general, We don't go to interviews in general. We typically see one person step forward, but there are a few occasions every year. And again, we don't need action on this because this will be coming directly to the full board Monday, but this is the curriculum committee, and these are your curriculum leaders, so we always try to give you a link to that. The last item I have is reporting on student progress and your guidance to Amy and me in terms of what you want to see for reporting. In your goals for 2021, 2022, as part of your return to school priorities, you had these two items. Track student achievement data on a quarterly trimester basis and prioritize intervention efforts to support student academic achievement. And then track student social emotional health on a quarterly basis and prioritize support for students' social emotional learning needs. Now, there's going to be pieces with state assessments, advanced placement, things like that, you will get as a matter of course in the fall. At some point in the fall, state accountability report cards will reappear. But this is separate. This is an interest you have as a board in seeing how we're doing in our emergence from the disrupted basically year and a quarter of pandemic schooling. And so at 2 points last year, Amy and I brought in some achievement data on assessments and then also report card or transcript data. So for secondary level, our F percentages, what was our average GPA? Amy had some report card data, including reading and grade level. And then we had some other assessments. And so we are preparing a presentation for the full board Monday that's very similar to what you would have seen in the winter and spring. It would have some of our local assessments like the STAR, and then we'll have the report card data. So that's really a roll-up from what we did, but that's a matter of kind of closing the books on last year. It'll take us up through June. In terms of what you would like to see for the quarterly and trimester student achievement data tracking and anything you want on interventions, before we get into the school year, I wanted to give you some time. If we talk about it today and we need to come back to it at a subsequent meeting after you've had more time to kind of consider what do you want this to look like? I mean, the frequency is fairly clear, quarterly, trimester. When we hit a point where you're grading data, you want to know. But what kind of depth do you want? And how much would you want to be on our data? And how much do you want to hear about what we're seeing with our interventions related to our student support?
So from my standpoint, I know obviously last year was horrible in terms of what they were able to learn. So this is all testing stuff and analyzing the data. In the board meetings that I've observed and then being on it, I don't see much talking about the actual things that are necessarily being done. It's a difficult thing to probably share, I guess, but you know, like, so let's say we see some pretty big drops and you mentioned maybe some intervention efforts that are being done. What are those efforts, or what is, like, when does that kind of get discussed? Like, how are we dealing with what we lost out on last year to make sure that we're gonna take care of that? That's, I mean, as opposed, we're gonna see all these numbers and we're probably gonna see some different things that aren't gonna be that great. What's the path going forward on that? That's the kind of stuff that I'm curious about.
And the fact that we've added, you know, those positions, in math, interventionist, it might be, you know, good after 9 weeks, or, you know, they kind of do some preliminary assessment, actually what kind of intervention they are doing. And it's always good to hear and see how we're utilizing those new positions. Just added to hopefully help with that.
So the soft side of the data, what does it look like in person?
Right.
Do we see kids
What-
more struggling,
what-
teacher comments, but
right.
that's not so much data, it's anecdotal, isn't it, more?
It is, but I think with those people that, you know, the positions that we've added, I would like to know how they're being utilized and how much, what does their day look like? I think that's just good for the public and the board to hear about, because that was a big financial, you know, outlay of positions, and hopefully they're making a difference. And I don't know how we can assess that without just hearing what they do and how many people they're meeting and helping on the daily basis.
I think it probably was 4 years ago, the last time we did an in-depth evaluation of what kind of outcomes we saw in intervention programs. But even when we did that, that was much more focused on taking students who was at a struggling level, and we picked a year, and we followed them through, I think it was 3 years, and where were they 3 years later? And that looked very positive in terms of the impact of our interventions. But even then, when the board had that information, we really didn't have interventionists come in to talk about, to your point, Joe, what does their day look like? What are, both in terms of scheduling, and also how many kids am I seeing? What am I actually doing with our students when I have them in my one-to-one or small groups?
And, you know, I'm concerned about kids being pulled out of other curricular for intervention, and I don't know if that happens, and if it does, I'd like to hear, you know, how do they reach these kids when you're in an elementary setting and everybody kind of does the same thing every minute of the day? How does an interventionist work with kids?
So it depends by the level, but what I'm getting out of this is probably, in addition to the data, it would be good for us to bring in some information on what do our intervention programs look like? Who are the interventionists? What does this look like from a kid perspective? What I would say is by middle school and high school, most students are getting academic support, or either getting it in a scheduled class, or they're getting it in contact and win time, or a combination thereof. Now, if they're in a course, they are getting that in place of an elective, but it's in place of an elective. Below middle school, you have the intervention block. And as long as a student only needs support in one of reading or math, the intervention block should be enough.
So there's an intervention block in K-6 or just 5-6?
K-6.
There's actually an intervention block
Daily.
for every kid.
Yes.
See, I didn't know that.
But where it comes in is, you know, if I'm struggling in reading only or math only, we can schedule time with the interventionist during that block to support me. The challenge comes in.
During my regular math time.
No, during my regular IE block. Where it comes in is if I need support in both reading and math. And that's where you will hear about students that might not be in, say, elementary world language, because they need support in two, and it's only one IE block. So where do we find the time in the day to support that child?
Yeah.
So, but that can all come in as part of the conversation.
I mean, I like the point Joan makes. We put all these in, how do we let the public know that we spent all this money and it's doing something? And that they're actually, these interventions are actually, what is it that they're doing there? I think maybe there was this black box before that we thought, well, they do this, they spent that time, and we just assume it works.
They do interventions.
Yeah.
Well, what is
And- You know, not only, but how do they pick the kids?
Mhm.
that need the intervention, and then that whole world, I think, would be great to just.
We can definitely do that. We do have, so you'll sometimes hear the acronym RTI, response to intervention. And that is what we call that system of supports. And we have a handbook that our interventionists have developed with administration over the years. It actually does speak to those processes.
To how they pick, but then the actual, one thing I hear about in the listening session with RTI is the labor of reporting, how RTI has been completed or, handled with each kid, and who does that reporting? Is that the interventionist or the classroom teacher?
So that's partly described in the handbook, and in most cases, that is the interventionist. I mean, so again, it depends on what kind of support we're talking about. But if the student is in need of more intensive support, the parent is going to get periodic progress monitoring reports from the interventionist about their child's progress. Now, when I do the parent-teacher conference, though, I'm also meeting with the homeroom teacher, and the interventionist keeps in contact with the homeroom teacher as well. And obviously, the homeroom teacher needs to, kind of know where each of his or her students are. The other aspect that's here is the interventionists are working with the kids most in need of support. During that IE block that's going on, the classroom teachers are also doing activities with kids. And so those activities, record keeping on that would fall to the teacher doing that, which would be. So it sounds like it's super timely to bring in some information so we can familiarize ourselves with
How it's done.
when we say interventions and when we add interventionists, what are the services?
What do they look like?
Yeah, what does that look like?
And then your second item up there, do you have a suggestion, Tim, of how that social emotional health? I don't know how you report or track. I mean, that's so kind of like Jude said, kind of a soft skill or a soft component to a student's ability to, be able to function in the classroom. They have to be emotionally healthy. I have no idea how we assess and track or meet with these kids. That's like so far away from my house, Tim. I don't have a clue. Now, Judy might have a clue.
Just cuddle them a little bit.
This is something more in the student services area. So
Yeah, and maybe
I know some about this. I think we want to bring Chris and some of our student services staff in.
Maybe a second.
Maybe not so much, but data is just what do you as professionals see happening in the school?
Yeah.
Give us a
Is
sense.
it, there was a staff member that took some of the medical advisory committees, and she said, and we were talking about mental health, and she said, it's not that I'm seeing more, it's just different kids have risen to the need, and some kids found, what we did last year, and they did more one-on-one. There was time to meet. There was, some connections that were made that were difficult to make during the school year. And, again, it would just be good to hear a report, but I think too from people who are working at that level of with the kids.
Definitely.
Well, there's obviously a lot thrown into the whole social emotional learning agenda. A lot of that is stuff that should be taught and done at home. And so then how do you balance this with people that actually, families that do it at home? And does that run counter to what's happening in schools? I think we see that happening now. it could be a very divisive thing in some ways.
I guess I don't know what you're saying, Tim.
Ted,
I'm sorry, Tim.
You
There's
call me
Tim. I've been calling you Tim, Tim, I'm sorry.
well, if you learn a bit about social emotional learning, there's a lot that is involved with that aren't necessarily, it's not reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? School was there to teach those basics, right? And it's really evolved where school's taking on a whole lot more things that really historically have been done in the family. They're responsible for teaching maybe values, things like that, that are now part of that aspect. Things that families teach on their own that maybe it runs counter to what's being taught in the schools. And then how is that filtered to the parents? I know how our kids were, what the teacher says, they're smarter than I am. I'm the parent. You listen to what but when our kids faithfully like, no, teacher knows better on everything. Well, I do have a little experience. I am kind of smart in math and things like that, even though you don't think I am. Stuff like that. That I think is a concern of a lot of people when it comes into that. It's a role that's being taken on that wasn't there in the past. Did you have social emotional learning in school?
I was thinking this was the kids' emotional response to school, and if they're having trouble learning because they're upset about something. That's what I was thinking, not a curriculum of teaching social emotional. Where am I on
Well,
that?
it's a term that kind of encompasses a lot of different things and has a lot of different meanings to people, but it's not really necessarily taking ABCs of learning school. It's really how you interact with other kids, society in general. There's a whole different, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a lot that has to do with it. It's one of those all-encompassing terms that is being thrown out that it needs a little bit more definition. Maybe.
So where would you see the definition of social emotional learning needs that you got up there? What does it look like in your opinion?
So I have an opinion on this. I mean, ultimately, these were goals set by the board. So I'm kind of interested. It's a good discussion for me here, just around the table. Historically, what B would be traditionally in schools would be very much in line with, what you're sharing. Which would be a student is not doing well in school. They seem to be upset. Something happening in school. Are they not doing with their friends in their classroom? Are they having difficulty organizing their day or their time? That would usually get the student kind of on the radar, for lack of a better term, maybe one of the school counselors. School counselor might meet with the student, depending on the school counselor's assessment. Sometimes you have small groups of kids you might pull out during lunch or the flex time and talk about friendship skills or talk about planning your time and personal organization, things like that. So typically it was responsive to that, and we have very skilled school student services staff, but they are not clinicians. So when a counselor or a school social worker or a school psychologist would see a student that really needed something beyond what we can support in schools, first of all, a student being in a group would be something that would not happen without a parent knowing about it. But then in the course of the counselor maybe working with the student, they might see something that struck them and maybe needed something more the counselor could provide. And so then they would follow up with the parent and say, here's what I'm seeing with your child. What are you seeing with your child? And have a conversation that goes from there. But to Ted's point, it does look a little different today than it might have in the past. And so now there is a greater focus, although not an entirely new focus, I'm kind of looking at social emotional learning in general. I mean, we've always had at the high school level what we call employability skills. And really, you always had, with varying degrees of formality, some kind of community building that would go on at the elementary level. I mean, I can remember, even back when I first came here in 1999, we had a program in the elementary schools called Tribes. And Tribes was all about building community. But it looked different in some respects. It wasn't standards-based, whereas today, the state of Wisconsin has social emotional learning competencies, and no matter where you go, you see school districts trying to build some learning opportunities for kids that are steered by those state adopted competencies, which wouldn't have been the case with a lot of the community building programs back in the 90s, the 80s, further back. And then there is some overlaps. We want to think about a Venn diagram between kind of the traditional student seems to be struggling with their socialization in school. That was the traditional way this might look. And the social emotional learning with state competencies and more formalized packages, which I think is, what Ted's speaking to, and, what's, this is a little different than some of the more academic subjects. We want a partnership between the school and the family in all things, but particularly in areas that get into values and socialization and pieces like that. So I do think it might be productive, at least here, to maybe split this into two different meetings. One where we, I think the data comes up on its own, but I think we have one meeting at least where we talk about what do our academic interventions look like, and what does that process look like, because that's one sector. And then I think we work with Chris Mand and the Pupil Services team and bring in another meeting. What does B look like in our schools today? And how does that match up with the work that is ongoing in social emotional learning? Because I think that is something that has come up. And again, bring that in as an informational topic, just like we would bring in these interventions. And then maybe after you see how those presentations to your group as a committee go, then you might have a conversation with the committee. Because again, nowadays we put all of our committee meetings on Zoom. That wasn't the case pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, you'd have to look at the minutes, and the minutes might give you a clear picture or a less clear picture than what actually happened. But today, if you're a board member or a community member, and you want to spend the time, you can actually catch up with the Zoom recording and see exactly what the conversation was in the committee. But I think once you see these in the committee, you may feel that this is something that should come up for the whole board, that it's not just you as a curriculum committee, that needs to do this, but it's worth the time of the board. And I can't answer that for you. As board members, you have to kind of balance when it makes sense in your overall portfolio of work to leave something with a specialized committee, and when something is of enough significance that it's had pre-work at the committee level, but then is significant enough to really be worth time for the full board.
I think A and B are giving us the background for the data that you collect so that we have a better understanding of what does it look like in the classroom, in the school, and the kids. Not just the numbers of how they've achieved, but how they've improved because of the intervention. So I like the idea of giving us some more background. And just for time's sake, coming to this committee first, or do you think it should be to the whole board?
I think it should start here. Because you probably have a fuller review and discussion here. But I think some of this needs to come to the full board, mostly for the public And I know the public has access to all of it, but in reality, you know, if I'm in the public and I know that the committee work always goes to the full board, they might just scan the full board and not go to the committees because of time. But I think that both of those topics are extremely important for our community to have information. And that sometimes only happens. But I think a greater discussion and review would be here, and then you could maybe streamline it for Tim to bring it to the board, so it's not an hour, but it's a 15-minute, and, you know, that's all we can really take at the full board for any of these topics, or it's we're here till 1 o'clock.
I mean, something to consider, and again, we would like to put up a referendum, that's a big time impact as well. I mean, we've talked about linkage meetings.
Yes,
Have been many years where the board would have special meetings every year where we would bring in special topics and we would kind of do that rotation piece. And so, again, depending on, there are a lot of different ways, you know, depending on what the committee sees,
right.
there are potentially different tools depending on kind of at a high level, how the board is prioritizing its time to the boards.
Yeah, and some of these topics might be for one of those, you know, more community, you know, linkage discussion, whatever we're gonna call those. You know, I know Randy is interested in setting up at least quarterly or some community discussions. And they may fit in. But I would like, you know, and I'm only on the committee today, so. But, you know, I think it's always good to go to a committee first and review it in the, you know, the fine details and then analyze once you go through.
That's one of the reasons why we have a committee system. And we put the time into the
Yeah,
committee system.
Exactly. Otherwise, the board meetings are so long and labored.
Well, and as you point out, I mean, we could potentially do a meeting where A is the main topic for that meeting, go an hour deep on that topic. Do another meeting where B is the main item, go an hour or more deep on that topic.
Exactly.
You can't do that on a regular basis at the board level and move all of the work that a full board needs to move along. So there's always advantages to specializing in the committee, and then the committee can decide what you want to bring back to your.
Or do we want to talk about scheduling A and B together, or one or the other? Do you have?
To me, I don't think it matters.
And I, you know, personally, again, I'm just kind of sitting here today. It seems like we need to get back in school and get rolling, and we have a lot of new people in these positions. And I don't see either of those topics really coming with the information that I would look at for about 9 weeks. I mean,
Yeah.
we need a couple months
To let them get in with the
let
kids.
let them start finding the data.
Well, especially since we just hired interventionists too, to let them.
Exactly, and we're
practice.
coming back to a school year that is so unique in what preceded it that I don't see that until probably November, if we really have the data that we want from these schools.
So we can put it on that kind of an agenda. Okay,
Yeah, and I would recommend having them be separate, because I think they both could take some time on their own. And right about the time, and I think everything we've been discussing, as I hear it, makes a lot of sense, because I think it would be difficult to expect anybody in early to mid-September to be able to say, here's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
We will only have had students at the door. We will only be getting to know them. Those kids, some of those kids have not been in school since March 13th, 2020. So I think looking, out to like the late October, November timeframe makes sense. The other reason why I would advocate for separating those is that's about the same timeline that we're gonna have to see when state assessment results come off in Fargo. I mean, I'm in kind of a unique situation right now where we have our state assessment results and we can look at them internally from a staff perspective, but I can't bring them in through a public meeting like this because they're under embargo. They will come off embargo sometime in the fall, and then at some point later in the fall, we'll have state report cards. And those will also be something you'll want to look at as a committee. And so what I would see is having one meeting where you'd be looking at both the state data and our local data and having a discussion about intervention, and another meeting where we just track the social emotional health piece.
So kind of a different in that last one when it says other reports to the committee or to the full board. Looking at going back to school this year, when I looked at, if we really want to assess what happened during the pandemic, and I've received a number of calls and concerns from the public of how do we know, and I know that the whole country is in this dilemma. So it's like your kids aren't going to be disadvantaged because when they go to college, they're going to college with kids around the country who have gone through this. But I thought one piece of data that might be interesting, and again, it doesn't really change what we're going to do, is in the past when, for example, middle school kid went into high school, how many went into advanced English, how many went into geometry compared to algebra. Is that a piece of data that may tell us something, although, it doesn't change the fact or the outcome. It just is, it might be interesting, especially if it's not that different. And I don't know how different it is it's just another piece of data.
So some of these things are further out, but if one of the interests was seeing, how many students were in different courses in, say, the 9th grade year compared to previous years and kind of what that looked like, that could be a piece we could bring into September curriculum committee. I mean, that data would be valid then. It's not very hard. It's not hard data to assemble.
Right.
I mean, I think,
I have had parents call and say, how do they compare? There's more of a nervousness of should they be trying to supplement their child to make sure they're ready academically for college. And I think it's all going to play out okay, because again, this is it isn't just Waunakee that went through a pandemic. It's much larger than that. But it might help answer some of those questions to see some of that.
yeah, I mean, there's things like, course participation for the year we're moving into that will be accurate and available by September. So we can do that. I mean, I think, these are questions I ask myself all the time. And, in some respects, we won't totally know for years. And that'll be kind of,
Right.
and it'll be interesting, so for example, our student tracker data, how, what percentage of our class goes to college, and of our students that matriculate to college, what percent come back for their second year right on schedule. That's always good information to track, but by the time you have it, those students are past graduation. So it's good retrospective information, but this information is kind of the problem-solving information we need for this year. And I understand, you know, and it's an interesting thing. I mean, we know last year, the last year and a quarter was very challenging and difficult. We know it was not how we would like to operate our schools because it was very different than how we would ever choose to operate our schools. We know it's very stressful for students, for the families, for our teachers. And there's no question that it had an impact on student learning. But teachers were working very hard to adjust to the situation. Families, you know, worked very hard to adjust at home to that situation. Those efforts have an impact. And then I think a question that's in some people's minds is, well, you know, our school district looked a certain way last year, other school districts look differently. How will that look in the end? And, you know, the only thing you can really compare it to in the upcoming year, and again, it's going to be complicated, would be state assessment data. But at this point in time, I don't know what any, you know, I know what our data look like. I don't know what the other school districts look like. We'll all run it together when it comes off embargo in a few months from now. And I think the other thing that I can tell you about our assessment data is we had higher rates of non-participation, particularly from 8th grade on up. And so when we look at our assessment data, and we're working on some ways to, you know, help everybody think about this, but you know, we have grades where 25, even 35% of students can take the state assessment, and so you're comparing assessment data with a lot of your kids not in the pool.
Yeah.
Prior years when kids were in the pool, it's going to be complicated.
Well, to John's point, though, if we were to look at asking the teachers of, say, those that are teaching geometry, the higher classes, by the end of the semester, how do you think your kids came in?
Yeah.
Did you feel like, compared to what you taught before, are they there? It would really be anecdotal soft data, but you'd have a sense of, whoa, we really have to do catch up. I don't know that the teachers know if they have to do catch up yet. They have, when they get them in there and get to know them and try their subjects, how, I would be interested in hearing what teachers think by December, how things are going, where they are, where they're going.
You know, and it's kind of like kids come into kindergarten. Some can read on 3rd grade level and some haven't seen letter A yet. And, you know, truly by the time they get to 3rd grade, it seems like it's almost, you know, we still have higher and lower reading abilities, but boy, does that kind of, you know, that
Zero.
difference, which is like this at kindergarten are like this at 3rd grade, you know, they. So will that also happen in this case? I mean, kids, will they all kind of level out at the end? Yeah, you know, like in an academic subject like math, the kids who would have seen calculus, maybe they don't all get to that level, but that's really a college course anyway. And the most important thing is, do they have the background to be able to do that class whenever, you know, they're exposed to it? And it's that, those fundamentals that, you know, we really need to be worrying about.
So we're trying to solve problems before, you know, we just don't know what we're
We
going
don't
to do.
We don't know.
Well,
So,
I think the one thing we can say is when you have a disruption to your standard ways of doing business, you're going to see more variability in student learning. So the picture will be less neat than the picture we're used to seeing. You will see some information where you might even wonder if there was a pandemic.
exactly.
I mean, I can tell you when you see it, there will be points where actually we think of one area where we have the best result we've ever had. There'll be other areas where you'll look and you'll say, there's a pandemic for the last year and a quarter. You know, it's going to be a more, the variation is greater I would typically see. And I have to be careful about doing this, because I don't want to be, I feel like this is like seeing the theatrical trailer, the little tease, a year ahead of the film actually coming
Yeah.
out. And, you know, the stuff will come off embargo in September or early October. Then we'll all be able to kind of bring it.
Okay. So,
Should we talk about that last meeting? Ted, do you think you can make the one on the 11th? I'm happy to do it. That's what I say, yeah.
yeah, I'll be there.
And hopefully Mark will be there.
I mean, the things of that,
It's
thing-
8:30. I think it starts at 8:30. You said a
8:30.
minimum of 2, probably 2 and a half.
Yeah.
So by 11:30 for sure.
and the thing is, since it is a meeting, we're going to be reviewing 2 different proposals and trying to arrive at a recommendation. It's the kind of meeting where it's got to be an all-in meeting or not there, because to see the first presentation and not
Yeah.
deliberations isn't really going to be,
Wow.
you know, so that's the only caution I would put.
So you will.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
motion to adjourn.
second. All in favor? Adjourn, aye.
Thank you.
Did you want to set